Over the last several weeks, we have examined Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams' 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. We looked at the first 4 stones. Revelation is continuous. The idea that new understandings of the mystery of life are always unfolding. Mutual consent. The idea that relations between people ought to be free of coercion and rest instead on the mutual free consent of each person. A just and loving community. The notion that we have a moral obligation to create a world where all people are honored and respected. And no immaculate conception of virtue and the necessity of social incarnation. The idea that nothing is good in and by itself, but only in its actions in relation to the other. Today, we look at Adams' final smooth stone of liberal religion, an attitude of ultimate optimism. This has been a difficult few months on the national level, with whole cities leveled by hurricanes or forest fires, national parks like Joshua Tree being vandalized and rare Joshua trees chopped down, government shutdowns with hundreds of thousands of workers not being paid, and white people calling police against blacks for going about their daily lives. These are all things that seem far away from us here in Bradenton, Florida, but if we look a bit closer, we would see that each of us is going through our own versions of personal trials and tribulations, some of which are tied to the national conversation. With all of these events circling around us like vultures, it is difficult to see the truth in James Luther Adams' proclamation that we, as people of a liberal faith, should resolve to have ultimate optimism. But this is not just ultimate optimism because optimism feels better than the alternative. No, the reason for ultimate optimism is because the resources, both divine and human, are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify this attitude. We cannot rest on the laurels of the work that generations did before us in the areas of justice, whether that justice be racial, economic, or ecological. No, James Luther Adams argues that each generation must anew win insight into the ambiguous nature of human existence and must give new relevance to moral and spiritual values. The gains won by the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century must be redefined and won again in the 21st century, because the arc of history is always bending towards a greater, more inclusive justice. As our eyes were opened to the injustices of segregation, our eyes need to become open to the injustices of white privilege, because white privilege would seek to segregate again. The current government impasse regarding a border wall is not about border security, but about privilege and who will be allowed entrance to partake in that privilege. It is not about building the wall because the data reveals our border security has resulted in the lowest number of immigrants crossing the border at non-entry places in 19 years. The majority of undocumented immigrants establishing themselves in the states are not crossing the border illegally, but are arriving here on visas that then expire. Under the guise of immigration enforcement, white privilege is attempting to maintain its standard for living in America. That nation requires an immigration policy that is not solely to benefit the whims of white corporate America. Such has been our history with Mexican immigrants throughout the 20th century. We welcomed them, documented and undocumented, when their labor kept our farms and factories producing during 2 world wars, and deported them when those wars ended or when the economy took a downturn. It is this issue that will define our nation again, just as the civil rights movement defined our nation in the mid-20th century. Will we find ourselves on the side of justice? The civil rights movement of the 1960s was an achievement of justice for that generation, but we must not assume that the achievements of that era are fait accompli for all times. Reverend Peter Morales, former president of our denomination, wrote, "We are in a struggle for the future direction of American society. How we treat immigrants, especially those from Mexico and Central America, is today's equivalent of the civil rights movement. This is a struggle for America's soul. The real issue for us is how we are going to live in America in which Anglo-Americans, whites, or Americans of European descent are in the minority. That day will soon be with us. White Americans are already the minority in a number of states. The prospects frighten many people. The question is whether we can embrace the changes that are coming, whether we can thrive in this new America." In terms of James Luther Adams' fifth smooth stone, the question is, are we going to tap into the resources, both divine and human, to create an America that continues to hold its revolutionary ideal of achieving liberty and justice for all when Anglo-America is no longer the majority? If the politicians that think inflicting pain on Americans by shutting down our government for empty political gain is the best way to uphold the ideals of our founding parents, and if the politicians that have the power to reopen the government and give relief to government employees and others impacted by this shutdown refuse to pass a veto-proof budget, then the answer is a sad no. But the theology that our Unitarian and Universalist heritage derives from believed that history has a destination it is winging towards, where justice and grace prevail. History has a meaning that reveals something of the evolutionary direction of humanity. For our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors, it culminated in the creation of heaven on earth, a place where all people lived in harmony with the divine, a place where there was no longer any sorrow or pain from injustice. We sing of this place in our hymn. Come build a land where siblings together, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall, I'm not singing on tune, where justice shall roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. But history has also revealed the darker side of humanity. Adams states, a realistic appraisal of our behavior, personal and institutional, and a life of continuing humility and renewal are demanded. For there are ever-present forces in us working for perversion and destruction. We do not have to go too far back in our history to see what perverse and destructive forces they are. The financial crisis of 2008 was the result of intoxicating greed. Without the appropriate oversights, the banks allowed their intoxicated greed to demand for more wealth at the expense of the clients who sought them for loans to live the American dream. Knowing and hedging the bet that these clients could not afford the loans they sought, the result was an economy that loomed close to the edge of worldwide depression and families' fortunes and homes decimated. Yet even with this propensity to reveal the darker nature of humanity through greed and war, our prophetic faith, writes Adams, calls forth to have a dynamic hope, and at the depths of human nature and at the boundaries of what we are, there are potential resources that can prevent a retreat to nihilism. The resources, both divine and human, are available to achieve meaningful change. Divine here, for Adams, might refer to some supernatural resource, but it also points to something other than supernatural but wholly inspirational. The divine could be that new idea that breaks through the toil and struggle of rehashing the same old, and beckons for a new point of view. It could be that connecting thought that brings about a new way of being or a new way of operating. But ultimately, the choices we make will open up the resources that are available to us, both divine and human. We have a choice in the events that are occurring in the nation today. We can say it does not impact our daily life and therefore ignore it and then wonder how it came to bite us later. And bite us later it will. Some of us heard the reading of the play on Friday night about the lawsuit youth have brought against the U.S. government regarding climate change. So much of what we are seeing today is the failure to act in time, biting us for not acting sooner. The runaway forest fires in California, the mega hurricanes of Michael, Irma, and Maria are in part due to humanity's failure to reduce the high levels of carbon emissions being spewed into the atmosphere. Depending on how you analyze the data, the U.S. and China are number 1 and 2, the worst offenders. How many remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill off the coast of Mississippi back in 2010? The oil spill crisis in the Gulf might illustrate this better. We live several hours away from the spill. Therefore, we did not face the toxic oil fumes that caused health problems for asthmatics and others with breathing difficulties. We did not face our 134-year-old family business ending because there were no oysters to harvest. So because our location is on the other side of the Gulf, one choice is to ignore it, as Scarlett O'Hara says in Gone with the Wind. I will think about this tomorrow. After all, tomorrow is another day. Ignore it and continue our mantra of drill, baby, drill. Or downplay its significance, as BP has done by stating that there is plenty of shrimp found elsewhere. Or the amount of oil dumping into the Gulf was minimal. Or blocking journalists from seeing firsthand the vast wildlife succumb to oil washing up on the beaches, or denying government-confirmed underwater oil plumes 6 miles long. So ignoring or denial is a choice we could make. Or we could despair the loss of an ecosystem that impacts the world in so many multiple ways. The prospect of dead zones in the Gulf where no life can grow is certainly a despairing prospect. A video found on YouTube of divers in the Gulf to look at what happened under the water noted that the water is eerily void of fish until reaching a depth of 30 feet. However, this sort of despair shuts down the natural creative forces of life that is inherent in all of creation, including humanity. Or we can choose to do something about the spill. Here are 3 different choices, all based on the same data, with different conclusions made on that data. Organize to have legislation mandate stricter regulations on offshore drilling. Organize to encourage alternate forms of clean energy, such as solar and wind, to become standard over fossil fuels. Educate others of our participation in this interconnected web of life. We can begin to educate ourselves and others on how our personal consumption and craving of oil-based products has contributed to this event in the Gulf. The resources for making this choice are already available to us to achieve this. All we need to do is organize and tap into the populace into the populace will to have this achieved. Liberal religion invites us to not deny or despair, but rather to look beyond the present to what possibilities can arise and then act accordingly. Howard Zinn, in his essay, The Optimism of Uncertainty, writes about the vast surprises that have occurred throughout history. He writes, "There is a tendency to think that what we see in the present moment will continue. We forget how often we have been astonished by the sudden crumbling of institutions, by extraordinary changes in people's thoughts, by unexpected eruptions of rebellion against tyrannies, by the quick collapse of systems of power that seemed invincible. Justice, when it occurs, may appear to have happened overnight, but it usually is the result of a cumulative effect of many different events over time. A state law ending housing discrimination against gays, an executive order granting hospital visitation rights and respecting patient care directives for same-sex partners, a law addressing bullying in schools, the right for a lesbian mom to have custody of her children in a divorce settlement, another law passed barring employment discrimination against gays and lesbians, the ability for a transgender person to receive gender reassignment surgery in this country, the allowing for transgender folks to state their self-identified gender on a U.S. passport. These on their own do not seem like huge victories, but taken together, they begin to add up to represent equal treatment under the law. They begin to sound like justice. Howard Zinn ended his essay with this: if we do act, and however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Reverend Barbara Wells Ten Hove wrote, "Despite all that we do wrong, all the wrong that is done to us and the suffering we cause and endure, love is always, always there. Our job as Universalists is to preach that love wherever we go, and not to scare people about the end. Just hold each other in love and work to bring more love into the world." May it be so.